Graham's going to feed me some questions from the audience. I think just from my own observation, well, thank you for keeping to time, firstly. Very well-behaved panelists for early in the morning. Is that there seems to be, at least we seem to be aligned in terms of policy, the stuff Liz is talking about and the stuff that schools are trying to do, and kind of, the academic research, it all seems to be aligned that people do want this. We are trying to do the things that people want us to do. So it doesn't seem to be that there's a lot of objections. It just seems to be it's finding the right solution. Would you say that's accurate? Anyone feel free to jump in on any of these questions, by the way. We're not going to direct them at anyone particularly. Or if you don't answer, I will make you.
I'll answer.
Oh.
Go, Elizabeth.
Well, I think that for anyone that has worked within schools, each school is really unique, and the culture of the school is really unique. And what makes anything a success, whether we're talking about a school street or encouraging children to walk or cycle, really is that leadership. So often we've got lots of solutions, we've got lots of things in our toolkit, we've got lots of pointy carrots, or just carrots or just sticks, and it really is finding a solution, because there is not one size fits all with this kind of approach, and that's the same for school streets. It's the same for getting various types of accreditations, and it's very difficult sometimes to find that approach because it is so bespoke and so unique, really. And schools also have a lot of fatigue because there is a lot of things out there and they have different priorities to what we have. And it's just about working together and collaborating and finding what suits that school and that community best, really, which is time consuming. But once it's right, it tends to work quite well with strong leadership.
Yeah. Like you say, that kind of individuality for each school, it seems to be quite important. Did you want to add to that, Laura?
I completely agree. I think what was underestimated at the beginning is sometimes it was exactly just the support measure was too simplified, and it didn't really it wasn't really taking account of the real need of these parents. And I was working 1 day a week for the school. It wasn't really a full-time job. It was just being able to listen, to understand, and to create what the parents actually needed. And then that completely changed everything. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah. Do you want to? Are we going to take a question from the audience? Unless Asa and Caroline have got anything to add.
Yeah, I was just going to say something that I think this idea that there's a culture and also that there's multiple things that are needed is I think what's coming through in my policy analysis is that in the past we've very much focused on certain particular types of intervention, and now we're seeing a diversification of that. So acknowledgement in policy, like policy in Glasgow, that the importance, it's not just about having the walk to school week or those sorts of things, but it's having multiple things. So school streets, school travel plans, and access to bikes and access to training, and some of the iBike stuff, which is about culture, not just about but also then infrastructure. So these all of these things have to work together, and I think that comes through all of the presentations today, that there's no magic bullet, no silver bullet to solve all of this in one go. It has to be a complex mosaic of interventions that are tailored to the particular place and particular time.
I think that feeds into what you were saying, Asa, wasn't it, about the kind of public realm improvements as part of that?
Yeah, I think it's something that is perhaps overlooked sometimes. I mean, it's expensive, and I think that's perhaps why. But I think in interesting, I think to some extent, there's been a bit of a focus on school streets as the kind of way to approach the area outside of the school, and that is a sort of temporary and recurring closure. But there might actually be lots of other opportunities. And I think also the focus on travel behavior or certain kind of goals, but also just having an additional space for children and parents to kind of be in and perhaps socialize and interact has a lot of other balance, and perhaps also helps to build some of that kind of culture of different activities being recognized as within the street, or and that's only something that can be, or something that can be enabled more so through the public realm. So I think, yeah, thinking about the kind of numerous different ways that these things feed in is helpful.
Yeah, we've got a question from Alan, which I kind of really kind of relates to that, and I think this might be one for you, Caroline, because you were talking about this. That so Alan's asking, is children cycling for play on local streets still a gap, although that could have lots of educational and social value? Even the developing broad view seems to consider only utility cycling. Yeah, so as you were saying, Caroline, we talk about travel to school, but for children, but we don't talk about that independent mobility more generally.
Yeah, great question. And so there's definitely an overlap. And in the project that I talked about at the beginning, the one that we did for Climate Exchange last year, we looked at play, and we looked at the intersection between play policy and travel and sustainable travel. So we looked at that intersection, and there is definitely potential there, but there's very little in Scottish policy that draws those things together, apart from the playing out type of street closure or play streets. So you have these temporary street closures that allows a residential street usually to be a space then for families and residents to use it and take away the car dominance so children can play out. But I think Welsh policy comes in here, and I'd love to big up the Welsh policy folks who are doing some great work. So in Wales, they have this play sufficiency duty, which that's been in place for more than 10 years now. And that requires local authorities to assess play opportunities in their area, to match the play opportunities with the children in their area, and then produce action plans for improving play opportunities. That includes sort of supported play and play workers as well as physical play spaces. But the really interesting thing is that in the Welsh policy approach, they see the street as a place for play. And so that play sufficiency duty encompasses the neighbourhood, encompasses the places that children live, not just the play parks and not just school, but the street around their home. And it says very clearly that we should make those places safe for children to play, so they can ride their bikes and do everyday activities in the neighbourhood, and they can be safe as a pedestrian, as a cyclist in their neighbourhood. Scottish policy hasn't done that, and it's kept play as a separate thing linked to green space. This is new policy in Scotland. It's just coming into effect this year in 23. So it'd be interesting to see how this boils, but what this comes down to at the end, how it kind of shakes out in time. But it's very different to the Welsh approach, and I think that there's a big gap. There is a potential gap here about seeing street play and it being inclusive of cycling and wheeling is the other term. So yeah, using your scooters and those sorts of things. So yeah, loads of potential there, I think.
Do you want to add anything to that, Liz? Because we have had some play streets in Greater Manchester, but we haven't had a lot, have we?
No, there's various sort of toolkits out there on the Playing Out website. TFDM have got one, and local authorities, I think there was a commitment to allowing some temporary closures that weren't ongoing and permanent, i.e. not school streets, but just one-off community streets that they would be requested, and there wasn't the charge, because otherwise there is a highways charge for putting in a temporary or an experimental traffic order. I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting point. When we've been doing some feedback about some of our school street schemes at the moment, someone commented that the road being closed at pick up and drop off time meant that kids now thought that they could play in the street, and this was clearly said in a very negative way, which was just incredibly sad that children just aren't allowed to play anymore. But then if they sit inside on their Xbox, well, they're not getting outside playing, are they? And there's a real kind of tension, I think, sometimes, which is why I think ultimately, if we ask young people what they want and work with them, then we're kind of saying if they want that play space, then we can use them and their voice rather than being grown-ups that are making decisions on behalf of young people. But yeah, there's a toolkit online for anyone in Greater Manchester that wants to do community streets, it's called, on the TFGM website, and it's got a list of printouts and how to do it, who to contact in your local authority, how to do research, how to contact people. So there's lots of information out there if people do want to do this as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So we have got a question from for Laura. So for just hide that. So yeah, so Jill's asking if you had enough volunteers. I know you did a lot of the work yourself, Laura.
So yes,
I mean, does it ultimately have to
it's
use
an
AFPR?
interesting question. We did. Okay, I think we're back. Sorry, we did have enough volunteers, but also they were really motivated to, I mean, consider that they endure for 18 months and the camera actually should have come much sooner than 18 months. So the answer is yes. What is sustainable? It's hard to say. So in an ideal world, in my opinion, you should be able to have an enforcer school street scheme without volunteers, without a barrier, without a camera. Okay, because honestly, I never met a parent who didn't agree about air quality is important for their children, road safety is important for their children. And the children love to walk and cycle to school. So these are things where people really generally agree. But but honestly, it would have been possible without volunteers, without a bar and without a stick. So it's complicated. I think with the right communication, with the right work on parents and preparation, and you can really limit it, the time and and the amount maybe also of volunteers, because the other thing is, because the situation was very confrontational at the beginning, being the barrier wasn't a nice experience. So a lot of volunteers just dropped after a while. And we need more volunteers, but actually so you just need one volunteer if this is like a pleasant job. You know what? You understand what I mean? So it's very complicated, and I think my advice would be trying to avoid the confrontational situation as much as possible. Trying to have a dialogue, a communication with the parents, because this is something that actually it benefits the whole community.
Yeah.
So I don't know. And even now that we've got the cameras on, sometimes I think we've got cameras and nobody is driving through.
So it's an expense.
So we could have spent that money in a better way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Can I just come in there? Because I think this is a really interesting question about how we make policies work on the ground. And I mentioned Glasgow earlier on when I was talking, and Glasgow has got some interesting policy around bike buses and walking buses, and so encouraging those. But it notes in its active travel strategy that these should be led by parents in order to make them sustainable in the long term. And I think this is a really curious I was really surprised when I saw it, and I think it raises a really interesting or a really difficult question about how we make things work in the long term. And I think there is a debate and a discussion to be had about designing interventions which require volunteers. And as some people have argued, a bike bus is the symbol of failure, that there is no safe infrastructure, and we require people to shepherd children on bikes or to walk them to school because they can't do that safely themselves. So I just wanted to sort of add to this thing about the volunteering. I really like Laura's point about if it's a good, enjoyable job, people will do it. But the reality is many of these things can be really confrontational. And I know from my own children's primary school where a school street was implemented, and there were people threatening to beat up parents and telling them they were vigilantes and all sorts of things. And it makes it really hard to sustain those interventions in those confrontational situations.
Yeah, and I think there was, we saw the Bikey Bus presentation at the conference, didn't we, which is in Barcelona. And there was a real discrepancy between the areas that people could afford to spend their time volunteering to run the Bikey Bus, but in the lower areas with greater poverty, the people just couldn't afford to run them. So there's a real issue there around who can afford to spend the time volunteering to run these schemes, which, but like you say, if there's infrastructure, then you wouldn't need that volunteer.
Can I comment on that for a second? I think just on this this idea of kind of volunteers and ANPR, I think it brings up loads of really interesting questions actually, and I think people have touched on them already. But one of them I think as well is I guess the ANPR often is like the sort of technological fix for not being able to kind of maintain volunteer, and that's often I think that's right. And I think it's been really successful in kind of managing that. But I think also you end up kind of losing maybe some of the kind of interpersonal relationships, or the element of creating a space that is also a sort of social space, or one is distinct from the rest of the streets around it, without kind of that kind of human volunteer element, or some sort of kind of barrier being there. And I remember a school street that I was kind of doing some research on in Hackney, where there was a lollipop person who was kind of on a crossing nearby to the school street, but it was also kind of putting a kind of ad hoc barrier in the street when the closure time was, because the ANPR had too many exemptions or people kind of cutting through, and it kind of needed it to kind of reassert that space is like, no, this is actually closed now, and you're going to have to kind of negotiate this barrier. And it made me think a little bit about, and there was some indications I was doing some kind of very kind of close-knit analysis of what was going on that street, and kind of weirdly during the closure times for the remaining cars that were there, of which there were quite a few exempt, some of the traffic speeds increased even slightly, which is because there was now just fewer cars on that stretch of street than there was before. And so the kind of weird thing about that ANPR is that obviously it introduces a financial penalty for driving through, but that car is still there when it gets a penalty, and it's still perhaps in a space that maybe is less kind of managed in that way. So it's a really hard one. ANPR has kind of enabled this sort of really like a huge number of schools that maybe don't have that kind of social infrastructure or the social capital for parents to kind of put all that through. But I wonder if it's, there's a kind of, it has a different kind of implementation in terms of the scheme itself.
Well, it's okay because we won't be using any traffic enforcement anymore anyway, will we?
This is, there may need to be a reassessment of the volunteer school street going forward.
Okay. Actually, there is another question for you, Asa, that is, in addition to replacing car trips, have you considered replacing trips with public transport to active travel?
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. So one of in that data I was looking at, I couldn't tell, it wasn't individual level, so school level. So I couldn't see what people would be going from or to, just the kind of overall mode share of a school. But that is an interesting element. And I think actually the background trends for this were an increase across kind of all schools in London Reserve, an increase in private motor vehicle use in this time, which is before and after kind of years on either side of 2020, essentially, was what I was looking at. And then there was also obviously a decrease in public transport use, which is still quite marginal. It's only about 7% on average for primary schools in London. So there was that decrease there. And I think there was some sense, I mean, it's hard to know which trips were going where, but with some car use increasing at non-school street schools and public transport decreasing at all schools, it seems that there was a kind of sense that some of those trips were going to active modes, hopefully, then as opposed to car modes, but it's hard to know which way it was going. So I think that is an interesting issue. I mean, I know definitely in secondary school travel, it's kind of, kids in London get free travel. And I remember sort of talking to a local authority, active travel officers. I think it's a really challenge to try and get their secondary school students to consider active travel because they have so much kind of bus availability and affordability, and that being a kind of issue. But I definitely was focusing on private car use as the kind of method in there. But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that echoes the research Graham was doing around e-scooters. He found that they didn't necessarily replace car trips, but replaced like Uber journeys and maybe bits of public transport. So I'm just looking over at him because he's sat there. So yeah, it's kind of interesting how we think. There was a presentation again at the conference that if you increase, I think it was public transport options, it probably possibly takes away from active travel. So yeah, there's an interesting dynamic between different modes and how people choose, what they can use. Okay, so we have got there's a question from somebody called Graham Sheriff, but I think we'll skip that one. We'll take the one from Chaz. So if somewhere like Kirklees, if you know it, is in I think near Leeds, there's very little dedicated routes, no cycling commissioner, needs a lot more advocacy, lots more social modelling. There's lots to do. Where do you start with that? This is a general question, I think, for everybody. Caroline, you
get yourself a cycling.
Yeah.
Get yourself first cycling mare. So I didn't realise this because I thought cycling mares were some kind of formal thing. Well, they are a formal thing, but you can basically put yourself forward to be the cycling mare for your area. And there is a process you have to go to, and you do have to apply and kind of set out your agenda, but then you become the cycling mare, and you become part of a network. And we saw this in Dublin. So for those of you who don't know, I met Ian and Graham and folks in Dublin at the Cycling and Society conference in September. And I also met the Dublin Cycle Mare, and I also happen to know Inverness's Cycling Mare. And they have their own WhatsApp group. Who knew? This international group of cycling mares share their stories and share experiences and share tips. So that in itself might seem quite minor, but it can be enough to just start other people talking about it, or to give people a bit of confidence that if they put their hand up and say, could we do a bit more about this? That somebody won't just laugh at them and there's somebody else out there. So that might be a really great first step. Chaz, you should put your hand up, become the cycling mare for Kirklees. And I think once somebody starts some conversations, it can grow some momentum. But I'm not going to lie, grassroots stuff is really hard. I'm involved in stuff in Edinburgh, and it takes a long time. And you have the same conversations over and over again with the same councillors who refuse to accept that anybody has a different experience to theirs, but it's worth a go. So that's one suggestion. Let's get a cycling mare would be a good start.
Another suggestion, which sort of following on from that conversations and growing momentum, is to really encourage parents, carers, young people to contact their local counsellors, writing letters, making lots of noise, that kind of like soft agitation. It really does get people looking, and there's lots of ward councillors who have local budgets as well. So if Kirklees Council doesn't have a big pot of money to do capital investment, there could be some small measures that can really make a difference. Improving signage, repainting lines. I know there's a ward councillor in Stockport who's funded a school street. So there are ways that locally, if you apply that kind of pressure and agitation as well, it can start that snowball. I mean, as it said, like, grassroots is very difficult, and I think that ultimately having capital investment and having strong leadership which is committed to improving place, health, well-being and the lives of people in their area is really the way to get leverage on this.
Yeah, I think there's I think in my experience, local advocacy, that there are so many funding streams, aren't there? It's not just the big capital projects. There's lots of little bits of money floating about, and it's knowing, where they are, what they are, and what they can be used for. Just as to start something off, really. I think we might have time for one more question from somebody called Graham Sheriff. So in terms of cycling infrastructure, do we think there's anything particular we should think about with a view to encouraging children and families to cycle? Because we've been looking at, before you kind of hit me with all your ideas, we've been looking at the needs of older and disabled people in Wigan, and kind of what their unique needs would be. So do you think that children and families need something different from the traditional segregated routes?
Designing for like really young people, or the older people, or someone that considers themselves disabled or needs to use the mobility aid is the best way to then capture everyone else in between will be able to use that infrastructure. We know that there are some issues with segregated cycleway in terms of maybe if someone's got an adaptive bike or like a carry-on cargo bike for their children, that they could be a bit narrow at times. So I think it's all about the conversation, really. There's the TFGM are putting out the Streets for All design guide, which I think helps to acknowledge best ways that local authorities can plan these types of things, which I think is to be used along with the LTM 120 kind of design guidance. I think it's all about having a conversation and understanding the local needs. And I think it's all also about, I think there's a really important piece that we could look into about working with highways and those that are designing these schemes to get them to understand what it's like to be with a double buggy or to be pushing someone in a wheelchair. Because sometimes, like I said before, like just having a drop curb is actually what you need sometimes, or having tactile pavement and improved crossing spaces can really help. So yeah, I guess I think that encompassing the young and the old will capture everyone in between, really. I'm not sure if anyone else has got any other thoughts.
Yeah, can I come in? So I think one of the things that's really interesting, and you mentioned it in your presentation earlier, Liz, was about designing for 12-year-olds, and this is quite a common sort of technical standard that Sustrans and others sort of use. But if we want to be inclusive, we need to think about young children, and they have very different needs to older children who can cycle independently. So young children, so you might have very young babies who are on a bike, obviously on a bike seat or in a cargo bike. So we need infrastructure that allows for their parents to bring them safely. So comfort is important. So cobbles and tactiles are really bad for It's like bouncing along in these cargo bikes. So nice, smooth surfaces. But width is important. And I think the other thing to think about is that width, because when you cycle with young children, if they're on a balance bike or a scooter or something like that, you often want to be next to them, not behind them or in front of them, but next to them. So you can be talking to them about what they're doing and guiding them. So width of cycleways is really important. And I think that point links back to that double buggy, pushchair, wheelchair thing, that width is important. So designing to make sure that we accommodate all types of cycle, adapted bike, cargo bike, a long base, recumbent, whatever it is. So yeah, new cycling, new guidance is really important in that, making those standards work for those types of bikes, and to facilitate journeys by families together, because that's important with young children, but then also to enable young kids to negotiate, or children to negotiate safely the infrastructure. So being able to read it and know where you have to go. And I think one of the things about some of the new infrastructure that's going in, it's great to see it going in, but some of the junctions look really complicated. And some of these junctions where there's like a counterintuitive, in order to go right, to turn right, you have to follow a cycleway to the left and wiggle around. And I think that's something we need to think about in relation to children, is that being able to interpret the infrastructure and navigate it safely. I'm not sure that all of those design parameters are quite right at the moment. We've got a bit of work to do, but I think cycling in groups is important. And that's, we see that in Dutch and Danish context, that young people cycle a lot and they cycle with their friends, and you see them cycling along the street having a chat. So there's 3 young people on bikes talking as they cycle along. So we need infrastructure that will allow that to happen. So I think, again, there are some questions about, are we doing that? I'm not sure we are.
No, and I think that's probably a challenge for some of our Victorian, medieval, urban areas where there isn't a lot of space.
Come now, Ian. Come now. They did have cities and streets in medieval Denmark and the Netherlands. We're not the only place that has old streets.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for correcting me, as always, Caroline. We have got a couple more questions, so try and get through them. And we are overrunning a little bit, but we'll try and get through these. Is there any feasible way to legislate mandatory cycle training for children, or should we? I guess.
So, should I start?
You feel free, Laura.
So what we're trying to trial in now is to address all the children that cannot cycle they didn't learn to cycle, and set up a learn to cycle session in school. There was a trial before the end of the last school years, and there was quite a response from parents. It was really interesting to see that basically the situation was that either the parents didn't cycle or didn't feel confident to, and therefore the child that wasn't cycling, but it was willing for the child to start cycling. So we are trying now to work with the head teacher to really address all the children in year 4 and year 3 that cannot cycle, and teach them how to cycle.
And is that through the school? The schools arranging that?
So it's in collaboration with the company that runs Bikeability. And what I've noticed is that the children who are attending Bikeability are those that are from family who are already into cycling. It's like raining on a wetland, I would say in Italian. And so I said we should maybe find the children that cannot cycle and therefore they're not doing Bikeability in year 5. And they agreed. And so they said, yes, it's a great value bikeability for the children who can already cycle, but I will really tackling those who are more in need.
Yeah, yeah.
So yes, this is the future plan now.
Yeah.
Which again that brings to a cascade of events, because then the children are starting nagging the parents, say, and I want to cycle to school. And and the parents needs to brush up their bikes.
Yeah. Yeah. Often works. Does anybody want to add to that before we move on? Or
I look, I don't think we should make it mandatory, but I think if we're serious about cycling and training and things, you could add it to the driving test. Make that a requirement of the driving test. That's a young people thing, and I think we think often about young children learning to ride, but it's really important that as people learn to drive, they're also reminded about the vulnerability of pedestrians and cyclists. And it has been long suggested that there should be some integral part of the driving test which is about cycling.
yeah, that would be my view as well. Although I guess there's an argument that maybe we should be capturing them earlier. But yeah, for certainly anyone that didn't learn to cycle when they were children, I think that's worthwhile, isn't it? Just to make them aware of the vulnerability of cyclists.
There's some great professional training for HGV and bus drivers about cycling, which is it's sort of like one of those CPD things that they can do, and it's really powerful. I've seen lots of presentations about those trainers and the difference in attitude before and after doing that training, when they are forced to cycle around the city and see what it's actually like to be in a junction with things going, on either side of you, as a cyclist, and they changed their viewpoint as a result.
Oh, that is interesting. Is that in Scotland, Caroline?
It's a national thing.
Oh, is
Sorry
it?
to jump in.
That's right.
Yeah, it's
national.
Yeah, it's national. It's Clocks and Fours accredited. But yeah, if anyone lives or works in Greater Manchester, we do a subsidised course. So all an individual has to pay is the cost of uploading the CPD qualification to their own CPD file, and they can undertake the course otherwise essentially for free. So TFGM are running that with money from the Safer Roads Partnership. So yeah, if you know anyone who drives HGV or works within that area, again, get in touch. We've got these spaces and we want lots of people to go on them. Like Caroline said, it's a really good course for making awareness of vulnerable road users.
Yeah, that's really positive. Okay, shall we finish? We've got one more then. And this is from, let me just take this one off, bear with me. Yeah, Sarah's emailed in and said, what's the best argument we can make to councils and other bodies that active travel, I'm guessing she means generally, is worth investing in, or school travel? Let's say school travel.
I think the best argument is to get the young people and get them to say what they want. Because if I stand up on a stage and give a presentation, it's like, yeah, that's great. If a group of kids stand up, or young people, these can still be like, 17, 16, 18-year-olds. It has so much more impact and people just seem to resonate with it a lot more. So that's what I would be saying. It's not, sorry, Sarah, it's not a particular argument, but I think it's young people voice is what I think.
Yeah, there's multiple arguments you can make, but I think one of them is, for me, is about independence and empowerment. That active travel and enabling children to travel safely and independently to school at primary and secondary level is an important thing that we give to our kids, independence and autonomy. And I don't think there's anyone that kind of thinks that's difficult or problematic. Whatever your views on climate change or whatever, I think the idea that we should enable our children to be independent and autonomous is a really good thing to do. It's good for them, it's good for parents, it's good for society generally to have those young people being able to move around freely, safely, independently in their neighbourhoods. Great thing to do.
Yeah. Asa, Laura?
I don't have any. I mean, I think those are two really wonderful suggestions that I would agree with, and I think it's better than mine. But the one thing I was going to say is that there are lots of kind of interrelated benefits that come from these sorts of things around public health and or environmental impacts and such like. And the message can be tailored to your audience, I think is maybe in terms of that's what's maybe something that kind of comes out of the interrelatedness of the benefits of these sort of things.
Yeah, I completely agree. It just ticks all the boxes. And so.
Yeah, I think I would pitch it at the health level, such a strain on local budgets that if you have a healthier population, it's going to put less strain on your budget, appeal to their base finances. Well, I mean, that's great. I mean, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have to wrap it up there because, we've overrun actually. But yeah, thank you very much. Just a reminder to anyone watching that our next seminar on the 24th of October is to launch our report with Transport for Greater Manchester on the mobility and sociability of older and disabled people living in Leigh. So yeah, that will be a hybrid event. We have got some tickets in person, but online as well. So please join us for that. But thank you to our panelists. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Yeah, we'll see you again soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.